Martin Bell is one of the Next Century Foundation's most trusted advisors. As a senior analyst for the Next Century Foundation, he focuses primarily on security issues. He has a long history of involvement with countries in the Middle East, having both lived and worked in Yemen, Oman, Bahrain, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates. For many years, he worked as a chartered surveyor, affording him the opportunity to learn the landscape of the Middle East rather well. Welcome back to the English Hour on ANN Satellite Television. It's great to have you with us. It's good to be here. Thank you for joining us. Our guest today is Martin Bell. You'll be familiar with Martin. He's been on this program before, and it's a great honor to have him with us again. Actually, we have three subjects for discussion with Martin today. One is the whole issue of the current peace process, if you can call it that, in Syria and in regard to Syria, a place we know and love. The second is the future, the whole way forward, what's going to happen post, what kind of Syria do you envision, what do we envision for Syria tomorrow after all of this mess is over? And the third subject is a tough one, it's terrorism in Europe, the whole situation of the way forward after the Paris attacks, what this means for the future of Europe. Martin, good to have you with us. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me, William.
After 5 years of civil war in Syria, in response to the destruction caused by Daesh, or so-called Islamic State, the United Nations Security Council has finally passed a resolution indicating a unanimous desire for the pursuit of a peace plan. Under a deal struck recently in Vienna, Syrian government and rebel negotiators would have to form a transitional government and have 18 months to organize national elections. Was this a prelude to the resolution just passed at the UN? Following this would be attempts to secure a ceasefire. Does this destabilize Bashar al-Assad's position as president? Furthermore, given the devastation caused in the recent wars in Iraq and Libya as a result of regime change, would what we are doing to Bashar al-Assad actually be desirable? Can America and Russia reconcile their differing positions? Also interesting is the reaction of regional rivals Saudi Arabia and Iran. Where does Turkey stand at the moment? It remains to be seen how this plan will translate into facts on the ground. The opposition in Syria is composed of fragmented militia groups, making it very hard to negotiate with a single party. So, the United Nations has been struggling to find a way forward on Syria. I think a lot of it has been cosmetic. We had real talks in Vienna, and they didn't really get anywhere, is the way I see it. We had a disconnect between the major powers. In fact, what you had was the United States moved slightly on its position, which was to say goodbye to Bashar al-Assad. The United States moved slightly on its position. Russia and Iran moved slightly on their position, saying that there was a democratic future for Syria after the present crisis was over. And they kind of produced an agenda of sorts. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia and its allies were not happy. They were talking about no negotiations without Bashar al-Assad leaving. So you had this disconnect. This disconnect was not resolved. We went forward to UN talks, theoretically to make progress, but or to cement progress, but there really was no progress to cement. we still have no real ceasefire, no real way forward in Syria. The whole thing is a public relations effort, I think.
I would disagree with you, William. First of all, I think that the Vienna talks was a lead up to the negotiations that took place in New York prior to the meeting of the United Nations Security Council and the resolution that followed. You have to start somewhere, and the insistence by Saudi Arabia, less so by Turkey now, but the insistence by Saudi Arabia that Bashar al-Assad should go isn't realistic. It isn't realistic. The fact of the matter is that the Syrian government, Assad's government, still controls the majority of the population still living in Syria. And the opposition is not a political opposition. It is a very large group of independent militias who met, or whose representatives met in Riyadh under the sponsorship of the Saudi Arabian government to try and coalesce them and get them together. But the fact of the matter is that the opposition in Syria is fragmented and clearly doesn't have the support of the major superpowers anymore.
Well, too. I mean, there's opposition and there's opposition, isn't there? I mean, but if you're talking about the fighting force fighting against the Syrian government, if you like, to put it simply, because what we have in Syria is chaos. Actually, it is total chaos.
Yes.
It's not a Syrian civil war as you would understand a normal civil war. It's various warlords, but the fighting force opposing the Syrian government is itself fragmented into ISIS, or Daesh, as it's called in the Middle East, and Jabhat al-Nusra, and their allies.
Yes.
The rest are really irrelevant, aren't they?
I agree with you.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, I mean, you have these two major blocks. They're both quite frightening, if you like, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, because Jabhat al-Nusra is Al-Qaeda, or at least it allies itself to Al-Qaeda.
It's franchise in Syria.
Yeah.
Yes.
So these two blocks, I mean, were they present in Riyadh? They weren't present in Riyadh. So the people with the guns are not party to these discussions. Obviously, they're regarded as pariahs.
They're regarded as pariahs. Certainly, they're totally unacceptable to the Americans, and therefore to the rest of NATO. But on the other hand, they are wholly dependent on Saudi and Gulf state financial support and weapons. And on
yes, I mean up to a point. Many cases, it's rogue individuals that are funding them. But yes,
well, rogue individuals, but rogue individuals who the Saudi government could suppress or control if they wish to. And also, they are wholly dependent on the Turks to allow supplies and money to cross over the border.
Absolutely, I'm with you there. Yes.
And what is more interesting is not the attitude of Saudi Arabia, but it's the attitude of Turkey. Turkey was involved in the negotiations immediately prior to the United Nations Security Council meeting and resolution. And it is an indication that Turkey has very different interests to Saudi Arabia. They have suffered the consequences of this war quite significantly. And in two respects. First of all, they are having to accommodate by far the largest number of Syrian refugees, which in itself is an unstabilizing factor in Turkey.
Well, both Turkey and Lebanon, though.
Turkey and Lebanon.
But, yeah.
But let's think for the moment about Turkey, because Turkey has a seat on the negotiating table. And the other thing that's happened has been the resurgence of Kurdish militias or militia in Syria, and their alliance with the Turkish Kurds and the threat that Turkey perceives from that. So you can see that there are some very significant advantages to Turkey in seeing this conflict wrapped up. I don't think now that the Russians have intervened and the Iranians have a larger presence in Syria, that Turkey thinks that the anti-government Sunni rebels are going to prevail. They're not. I think Russia has gone, bang, stop, you don't come into Latakia, this is where our bases are.
But
Martin,
you're saying they're not going to prevail, but the convention anti-government Sunni rebels are not going to. Wait, I just question that statement. You got Daesh, the anti-government Sunni rebels, and Jabhat al-Nusra, allied with Ahrar al-Sham and so on. But I mean, they're not going to prevail.
Daesh are not a significant threat to the Syrian government at the moment. At the moment, they're more concerned with trying to maintain their supply lines through to Turkey, and the threat to Daesh comes from the Kurds. What you see happening on the ground now, particularly in Homs, quite recently, where Jabhat al-Nusra effectively withdrew.
Yes,
under the auspices of a United Nations negotiated local ceasefire.
Well, a degree to which the United Nations negotiated anything is debatable.
Right. Okay.
Right,
but it put its flag on it.
Yeah.
And it organised the buses.
All right.
So
there we go. Yes.
okay.
Yes.
But it was a local deal, peace deal, and now the Syrian government controls Homs, and that is very significant because that is where the revolt first started. And the rebel fighters who remain, they're allowed to keep their small arms, but they've agreed to their area being policed by the Syrian civilian police. This is the start of what I think is going to be a number of locally negotiated ceasefires that are going to develop. And there is some promise in that. You know, at the end of the day, Russia has made it quite clear that it wants to see an election for the next president.
Well, yeah, but
whether it's not in Russia's interests to prop up.
Election is not the election we're going to have shortly. Is not for the next president.
No, it's transitional government. This is correct.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's some questions over whether those will be fair elections, although the United Nations has said that the elections will be under its control.
They're already rigged. I mean, the outcome is known to everybody. I mean, the chances of having free and fair elections are so remote.
Well, the fact of the matter is that what the United Nations and what the main powers are aiming at is some form of coalition that draws in Sunni opposition leaders who are willing to work with the Syrian government, and that means the Alawites and their various supporters, which includes Syrian supporters, as Sunni supporters, obviously. That has to be the way forward. You know, I have a positive view on this. It's very easy. Well, it's not very easy, but there is a tendency for everyone to say, "Oh God, this isn't going to happen. This is just the United Nations making some noise. It will be ineffective." I don't think so, because what this represents is the combined will of Russia and America, and beneath that, their surrogates, Turkey on the American side, Iran on the Russian side.
You really think Turkey's going to be on message? Because Turkey has been much of the much of the problem. I mean, much of the problem. They've been massive supporters of Daesh because of their.
I know. They've supplied Daesh with thousands of four-wheel drive Toyota pickup trucks.
Yes.
You know, as the Russians pointed out to the Americans, who were rather surprised. The point was that the Daesh now know when the American satellites pass over their territory, and they put their cars away and run indoors. But they hadn't been doing that when the Russian satellites went overhead. So I think the fact of the matter is everyone now knows that the extent of Turkey's involvement with ISIS. But as I get back to what I said earlier, Turkey has a major problem coming out of the Syrian civil war. If it now accepts that the Syrian government is not going to be defeated militarily, and it's not, because the Russians are now there propping it up and the Iranians are there propping it up, what does Turkey do next? Well, it has to cut the best deal it can. It has no alternative. And it can't carry on with 3 million refugees living in tented camps in Turkey. That is a major, massive potential source of instability within their own country. It hasn't happened yet, but it will do. If those become long-term camps, the disaffection, the revolt that will brew up in those camps is something that Turkey can't accommodate. And then there's the problem of the Kurds. There's already problems with Turkey's Kurds. Erdogan's government has fallen out with them badly. The infection from the allied Syrian Kurds, who are ruling the roost up in northern Syria at the moment, and have been very effective fighters against ISIS, winning the Battle of Kobani, inflicting the first defeat on ISIS, causing ISIS something like 3,500 deaths.
Do you think so? That high? Yeah.
That's a pretty accurate figure. That would include, of course, those ISIS fighters who had attempted to reinforce Kobani from Raqqa, who never made it, and were taken out by airstrikes and Western Special Forces action. But this is something that Turkey has to now face up to. It needs to resolve it. It can't carry on with the civil war in Syria because it's now hurting Turkey. And I think you will find that Turkey, whilst it may come round reluctantly to the American position, I don't think it's going to destabilise it that much.
Interesting. Well, that's positive. I guess that's positive. I mean, it seems pretty positive to me. I kind of go along with you. I mean, I know I've been devil's advocate. I don't like the fiction that there is agreement. The fiction at the UN that there's a ceasefire when the main warring parties have not laid down their guns. You know, I mean, there is an element of saccharine public relations about what's been coming out of the international community that is unreal.
I agree with you. The politicians wish to demonstrate to their voters in America and Russia and Europe that something is being done. I think the images that TV images that are coming out of Syria, particularly the civilian casualties and the refugees crossing over from Turkey onto the Greek islands, are so distressing to the public that there is a public demand that something is seen to be done. So the pressure is on the politicians. But Russia we also need to think about Russia. You know, Russia has stepped in to protect its interests. Okay? At the moment, its interests are in propping up the Syrian government and the Assad family. You know, you've got to remember that the present president's father, Hafez al-Assad, was trained in Russia as a fighter pilot and spoke Russian. And the Russians were intimately involved in his takeover or his coup, where he seized power in Syria.
Really, you'd say so? That's interesting.
Oh yes, yes. He didn't do that on his own. He had help. But we're going back now more than 50 years. But look at the situation now. Russia wants a stable ally in Syria where its bases are protected, It doesn't want to have a military presence in Syria other than fighting a civil war. It just wants to have nice, safe naval and air force bases.
Yeah.
And they will cut a deal with anyone.
Given the huge devastation in Syria, reconstruction needs to be a centerpiece of peace negotiations. But who will fund this reconstruction? A peace process needs to be carefully implemented, and a ceasefire is essential. However, once a ceasefire is secured, what becomes of jobless fighters when they are no longer fighters? Perhaps such men can be employed in the reconstruction of their country, but importantly, they need education. Again, this calls to question what form of government will ensue and how will they address the needs of their citizens. Additionally, there is the matter of the large number of refugees and migrants that have fled Syria, a number of them skilled, thus causing a brain drain in Syria itself. I mean, we are agreed there is hope.
Yes.
Given the vast effort that's going into all of this, there is real hope. Let's be fair. It is tremendous that the whole international community is paying attention to resolving this mess in Syria. So, hooray for that. But let's come to the next subject we've got for discussion, which is what next, if you like, the aftermath, the reconstruction, the future of Syria post-conflict, God willing, and take that in hand as an issue.
Well, the devastation in Syria is colossal.
Well,
and reconstruction has got to be a major element of the peace negotiations as they move forward. There has to be the money, and but also out of that comes an opportunity, because there's not a lot of things a young fighter can do once you've got a ceasefire. Most of them are semi-skilled young men, even unskilled. And because the highly skilled, the professionals have all scarpered and gone elsewhere.
yes,
Probably in those crowds of tens of thousands hiking up to Germany. There have to be jobs for returned rebel fighters after a ceasefire. And the opportunity is in construction, and it's an opportunity. I see it as for the Americans, because they are still the wealthiest country in the world. Saudi Arabia, because it has an interest in seeing, if you like, its people taken
Yes.
care of, and the European Union, who actually have done very little. But are also, in comparative terms, exceedingly wealthy. Germany traditionally doesn't like to take part in fighting, but it does have a very substantial foreign aid budget. So I see an opportunity for a number of foreign players to donate aid for the reconstruction of Syria. But that has to come with strings attached. It can't just be money paid over to the Assad government. It has to have, if you like, an element of democratic control to it.
but there's more to it than that. I mean, if you're going to have foreign investment in Syria, but God willing, we already do see some construction. There's construction going on in Homs. We discussed Homs just a moment ago. And so there is an element of rebuilding taking place, astonishingly, even in the middle of this war. But if we're going to see reconstruction, we're putting the cart before the horse here. What kind of Syria are we going to have? I mean, are we going to have a united Syria?
Well, the Security Council resolution envisages a unified Syria, but there's different degrees of unity. In the same way that you can see Iraq evolving into a number of autonomous, highly autonomized,
Yes, a
autonomous
confederation.
regions, a
Absolutely.
confederate of autonomous regions. I think the days of a highly centralized government ruling out of Damascus over the whole of Syria is not going to happen. What I see evolving is a number of autonomous regions. I don't think the Syrian Kurds are going to accept a return to the old ways, and to provide a degree of self-government to disaffected Sunnis, there has to be a much stronger form of regional government, provincial government, which leaves the central government primarily with the role of foreign affairs and defence of the borders. Certainly within those regions, autonomous regions in Syria, policing should be a regional matter, so that people don't live in fear of a government in Damascus knocking on their door at 4 in the morning. There has to be a much greater devolution of powers from the central government in Damascus, and I think that would work. And at the same time, the administration of the aid funds, the reconstruction, should be a regional matter, so that regional governments elected by their own people can administer foreign aid. That's the way I see it developing.
Yes, so a kind of confederation. We don't have confederations in the real sense anymore in the world, but kind of like Switzerland once was, an association of...
Germany is in part.
In theory, maybe, but...
Well, yeah, but the Länder, the provincial governments in Germany are quite powerful and have a lot of control over matters like health and education, and policing as well. So there are models that would work very well for Syria, and I see this as being part of the solution. But of course, you have to have a ceasefire. You have to have an effective ceasefire. Somehow or other, the guys with guns have to see that there is a future for them, which will be difficult, because if you're a warlord and you're controlling an area and you're making money, and let's be honest, a lot of this is about money, you're not going to willingly give up that power.
So you're talking now, your scenario, peace in Syria, is this, are we talking looking forward to 2021 when Bashar al-Assad, his term in office ceases and he retires?
No, it's got to be much earlier than that.
You're going to see this while President Bashar al-Assad is in power? You're going to see this?
Well, there is going to have to be some transitional government that leads to a longer term arrangement. Now, it may be that the Russians, because they don't want to be seen to be abandoning their man, it may be that he retains a role. But there's going to have to be an involvement of the opposition in a transitional government, and not some placeman acceptable to the Alawites.
But that's what we're doing. I mean, when I hear people from the international community talking about the Sunni element in the new power-sharing government, if you like, or the opposition element, they already have somebody in mind to be prime minister. I mean, I won't name his name, but it's anyway.
Well, that's wishful. That's wishful thinking. If that person does not have, if not the support, at least the acceptance of the militias, the Sunni militias on the ground, then it will be pointless. It has to be somebody who has the respect of the Sunni militias.
Let's look at this. We have an election in let's say 6 months, a year, whatever it is. At that election, before or slightly afterwards, there is a move towards a new constitution, possibly, yet another new constitution. We have a situation where the Prime Minister is given slightly increased powers, possibly, and the presidential powers over minor ministries anyway are slightly reduced. And then we have a power-sharing government, if you like to call it that. Then you want your reconstruction. At that point, the money comes in from the international
No, I
community.
don't think the money will come in until the shooting stops.
Right.
You're not going to get international aid funds, by that I mean governments, investing a large amount of money in reconstruction if there's any risk that having put up a block of flats, somebody's going to come along and blow them up again. It's got to be a transitional government that is able to negotiate a ceasefire on the ground.
But you envisage, so we're talking about a ceasefire. I suppose if the whole international community comes on board, including Saudi Arabia and its allies, then we can envision a ceasefire that brings on Jabhat al-Nusra. Daesh, there will be no ceasefire.
No.
So while we have, is the assumption here that if we have stability in the rest of Syria and just Daesh to deal with, reconstruction begins then?
Yes, I think that is a realistic assumption. I think Daesh in Syria can be contained. It will be contained if the border is closed off to it. If Turkey ends its support for Daesh, then Daesh's days are numbered in Raqqa. It may attempt some lightning strikes around just to remind everyone it's still there, but its days are numbered. If Turkey stops supplying Daesh, then Daesh really has no alternative but to withdraw back, or to go, funnily enough, where Al-Qaeda told it to go in the first place, which was Iraq, or return to its roots in Iraq. But going back to the transitional government, I don't see the existing government carrying on with a tame Sunni politician as being enough. It's got to be someone who has sufficient stature and independence for Turkey and Saudi Arabia to say, okay, we can work with this guy. And we can see him or them moving the country to back into peace, far greater involvement of the Sunni population, returning from the refugee camps, a reconstruction program. In other words, the dividend of peace. And that's not going to happen if this person that the international community, in other words, the diplomats in New York, seem to think is the answer. That's not going to happen. It's got to be somebody that Turkey and Saudi Arabia are confident will have some clout within the government. And from the Alawite point of view, it's in their interests. They can't carry on. They can't carry on for another 7 years if the Russians say, we won't support you for another 7 years.
They're feeling quite confident of Russian support, but yeah, no, I get your point.
The Russians don't plan to stay there for 7 years. They want this wrapped up. They really do. They've got other problems on their plate. They've got the Ukraine, which is a major issue for them, far more important than Syria. You know, it's on their border. It's caused major problems with the West, who incidentally are their major trading partners, and they want to sort that out. They don't want this running sore in the Middle East, draining their efforts and their attention when there are more important issues to deal with. So there is undoubtedly a time limit to the support that Russia is willing to give to the Syrian government, and they will expect the Syrian government to do something to re-engage, admittedly, a completely shell-shocked Sunni population. The bitterness and the hatred that civil wars engender
is astonishing.
It never goes away. There will be children children now, 3 or 4 years old, who will remember it and carry the experiences for another 60, 70 years. So
Yes,
it's got to be stopped.
Yeah.
It's got to be stopped, and I don't think the Russians want it to carry on. But at the same time, their ally, their surrogate, Iran, wants to retain some degree of influence in Syria.
I hope and pray, all right. I mean, we've seen good intentions before from the international community. You could say there were good intentions with regard to Afghanistan. There were good intentions with regard to Iraq. Now do we, and you know, there were good intentions with regard to Libya. I mean, everything the international community touches turns to dust and ashes.
I disagree with you, and I'll tell you why. The UN comes into its own when everything on the ground is so horrible that nobody wants it to carry on. In other words, everybody is sickened by it, and then the United Nations is a useful vehicle to try and cobble together a deal. As long as people think that, or as long as nations think that they can secure an advantage by continuing a civil war and by poking their nose into it and giving guns and money and this sort of thing, then a conflict will carry on. It's only when eventually all the different factions are worn out and sick to death of it and the cost involved, then the UN is there ready to step in and, if you like, act as an umbrella for a deal to be done.
Well, let's hope and pray.
Same thing happened in Bosnia.
I hope then you're right. We move on. We have a third subject. Actually, we should have maybe begun with with this one and moved to the others, because the third subject, well, maybe we can find something positive out of the third subject too. With the rise in migration, there are increasing fears of foreign extremism traveling to Europe from the Middle East. Despite these fears, the recent attacks in Paris were, in fact, examples of homegrown radicalization. Who is at fault for these attacks, and how should we respond to them? Is there a difference between targeting civilians and collateral damage? Furthermore, it is arguable that these events simply gave rise to further Eurocentrism, again failing to address the root of the problem. Martin, where do we go with migration, massive migration into Europe, and the consequences of that?
Well, it was quite surprising that the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, virtually opened the door to Syrian refugees. I don't think she had any idea what the result of that one statement would be. But you can understand, if you're a young man, and most of them are young men, you know, when we occasionally see video shots of mothers holding babies, but you stand back and you look at a distance, and
yes,
overwhelming majority are young men stuck in refugee camps in Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan. What do? They see no end to the conflict in Syria, and then suddenly this Europe's leading politician says, well, there's a job for you in Germany.
Yes.
Come here. Of course they have. What we've seen are tragic events in the Aegean Sea, and then literally hundreds of thousands of people walking up through the Balkans to this new dream of life in Germany or Sweden. It's wrong. I'll tell you why it's wrong, because all the energies of Europe should be focused on trying to get the civil war ended in Syria and to pour economic aid into Syria to rebuild. It is, in fact, an expression of despair that young men will leave their families and go off to a country that they don't know, with a language they don't speak, to do menial jobs. They should be going back to Syria. They should be helping to rebuild their country. And
but given, I mean, we've got Germany taking 500,000 a year or whatever. We've got all of these migrants coming in. It's a fait accompli. It's the way things are. Are we going to build walls around Europe? Are we going to end Schengen? What is?
Well, we're not part. Britain is not part of Schengen.
No.
We stand apart from what's going on continental Europe.
Mm.
But the Schengen Agreement, which permits
Yes.
passport-free movement around the countries of the European Union, amongst those countries that belong to the Schengen Agreement.
And now some have been added. Turkey, most notably, in recent years. Recent weeks. Yes, has been added to the Schengen Agreement, and they as a reward for
Supposedly clamping down
yeah.
on Syrian refugees leaving Turkey.
Yes.
It's a desperate state of affairs. I think the Schengen Agreement is looking very shaky. Some countries have already put up the walls you're talking about. Hungary, in particular, has put a security fence along its border. And within Europe, countries like France and Italy are now starting to check passports at borders. They're saying, this is an emergency situation.
Sure is.
But this is a short-term affair. I don't think, to be quite honest, that Europe really is very interested in what's been happening in Syria. And the response to the ISIS massacres in Paris is really an illustration of it. I think one of the most interesting comments I heard from the Middle East in response to the attack on Paris by ISIS was, well, hang on a moment, the same number of people were killed by a single car bomb in Lebanon. Where was all the hysteria
No, I mean
in the world's media over that?
No.
They take it for granted. There are thousands of people being killed every day in Syria and Iraq, and then this one event happens, and let's be honest, I don't hold a brief for ISIS. I don't in any way support what ISIS has done, but the fact of the matter is that the French Air Force has been bombing ISIS for very many months.
Yes.
And all they did was bomb them back.
Yeah. Well, I don't.
It's tit for tat.
No, but
You disagree.
well, I don't see it in quite that way.
Well, how do you see it?
Well, I mean,
Don't you think it was retaliation for what the French
deliberate targeting of civilians? I mean, it is.
William, if you bomb someone, you kill civilians. It's almost unavoidable.
Nonetheless, it is the international community. I mean, I have huge issues with the level of collateral damage, and we've seen this.
Quite
Kobani,
right.
70% of the town gone.
Town's written off.
Yeah. So, I mean, huge issues with the way the international community behaves. But ostensibly, at least, they are not setting out to kill civilians. Whereas this is an operation that sets out to be a terrorist act, sets out to kill civilians. And plus, two wrongs do not make a right. The fact that there is colossal, and I am ashamed. I'm a member of the British. I'm Anglo-American actually, so I have two reasons to be ashamed of the civilian deaths that take place in these bombings, and they have been taking more every day. But nonetheless, you cannot say that two wrongs make a right. That it is justifiable to deliberately set out to kill innocent civilians.
I'm not saying it's justifiable, but I do understand what motivated that attack on Paris. The French have been bombing what Daesh considers to be its capital, Raqqa, and has undoubtedly killed civilians while doing so. And if I were an ISIS fighter, I'd want to hit back.
Yeah, but not in that way. I mean, I'm sorry, but not in that way. It is dishonourable to deliberately attack civilians. It has to. I mean, it's a basic point of honour, isn't
And
it?
if you are, even if you're using laser-guided bombs, and you are attacking a building, you will kill the civilians in it.
Surely, yes.
Okay.
I appreciate that.
And look at the effects of Israeli bombing on Gaza, where the Israelis only used so-called precision-guided weapons, and then look at the casualties afterwards. By far, the greatest number of casualties were civilians.
Well, I mean, it's
So
like
the
yeah,
same
no,
thing is
I
happening.
don't dispute. I mean, Britain decided when it sent its warplanes into Syria, limited though they were, they decided to put in huge daisy cutter style bombs. So we went in to take out those oil production facilities in
Yes.
northern Syria, and of course we said, well, we were just taking out targets that were valid in military terms, and we were not targeting any civilians. Of course, there's civilians there,
Sure.
civilian oil workers who are just ordinary people going about their job, whose lives end in an instant out of nowhere.
Yes.
I mean, so you never have no civilian casualties. It's just awful. Modern warfare is awful, but Britain, when it bombed those oil production facilities, was not aiming to take out civilians. It's a different concept. It's not.
Well, I would say that were I sitting in Raqqa and were I a Daesh fighter, this all sounds like semantics. It does. If you are being bombed, you want to get your own back. And whether it's morally right or wrong, I agree with you. I think it's morally right to deliberately target civilians in the way that they were targeted in Paris. But you can see why it happened.
Okay. Well, I mean, given that, and there is this natural tendency to, therefore, I mean, this whole business of the migrants coming in on this scale. I mean, many those who did these attacks in Paris were migrants in a sense. They were people who are not, by and large, French born.
Well, no, they were Belgian. I believe that all of them had lived in Europe before going to join
Yes.
Daesh,
Yeah.
and had come.
Come
Two of them
Okay.
had come back in the guise of refugees. That's how they got back into Europe.
Yes.
They weren't refugees
No, they
who became Daesh fighters.
Got you. Yes, of course. They went.
They used this huge flow, unregulated flow, of refugees from Turkey into Europe and up into northern Europe to as a means of getting back in without being identified.
So what do we do? I mean, we have this. Let's come back to this migration issue because it is polarizing Europe. We have an increase in extreme. I mean, reaction in terms of extreme right-wing politics in Europe is building up. Marine Le Pen is getting greater support. The right is getting greater support.
Well, you won't have read about it, but the German intelligence service has recently issued a report that more than 220 refugee hostels in Germany have been firebombed. That's a big number.
Yes.
That's a big number. And it's an indication that there is a growth in confidence, if not numbers, by the extreme right wing in Germany.
It's very distasteful. I mean, it is horrifying that we're getting this polarization within Europe. What are we going to have for the future? A kind of racial tension within Europe that is.
Well, I think Germany has managed to accommodate Middle Eastern workers for decades, Turkish guest workers, supposedly. Turkey actually needs an influx of young workers because its population is becoming too old.
Turkey needs Germany.
Germany needs an influx.
Yes,
Sorry,
that's
sorry.
all right. Confusing me there.
My brain was already ahead because I was about to say, well, Britain got round that by importing millions of young workers from Eastern Europe.
Well, yeah, we didn't actually. Britain did. Okay, I'm not sure that Britain really. This is Britain's excuse for not taking Syrian refugees. Is the half? Well, no, I think the numbers are impossible to gauge. They say there are 4 to 5 million foreign passport holders now in Britain,
and about 50% of those are from Eastern Europe.
Well, easily 50%.
And they will adapt. They will integrate. Within a generation, they will be English. In the same way that the Eastern Europeans who came to Britain after World War II.
I have a Polish daughter-in-law, and I
there
don't know how
you
much
go.
adaptation there goes on.
But the fact of the matter is,
but nonetheless,
the
yes,
fact of the matter is that this has happened at a time when the nation states within Europe are rebelling against the federal ideal of Brussels anyway. There is a resentment towards the power of Brussels, and particularly with the French Front National. And this all happened before this influx of Syrian refugees.
So we're talking around in circles here. What we need is to decide, you and I, in our own, as if we were gods and we're not. Is it? I mean, to go back to the old idea of Khalil Gibran, the wonderful Lebanese Christian, what would you call him, mystic poet. Do we believe in a world without frontiers? I mean, do we believe in the free movement of peoples? Is that the ideal we should be working for, or because?
The answer to that is no, William. It's so impractical. It's so destabilising that it's never going to happen.
We've been through a year in which there has been
and it's
huge.
It's been destabilising. The solution to migration from the Middle East into Europe is primarily solving Syria. We've got to get a grip on Syria. We've got to help the Syrians, do everything possible to help the Syrians end their civil war. It's a horrible civil war. It needs to be ended as soon as possible. And the major powers have a responsibility to do what they can to achieve that. And that means leaning on all of the surrounding nations that are supplying and supporting the various factions within Syria. Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Interesting. Well, maybe that's a very positive note then, or we can just see an end to the war in Syria. We may have a safer world altogether for everyone.
For everybody. Yes.
Bless you, Martin. Thank you for coming back and being our guest on ANN once again. It really has been a joy.
It's a pleasure, William. Always tests my brain.
Okay. Thank you. So what did we learn? Well, the whole Syrian problem is ongoing, and I don't know that the talks in UN and the peace process are of themselves going to give us a resolution of this issue. But what is certain is that the whole international community, the whole world, is making an effort in a new way, and that we have got Iran, Saudi Arabia, well, I wish Saudi Arabia, Iran, Russia and America are definitely singing from the same hymn book. If we can but get Saudi Arabia on the same page, if we can get Turkey on the same page, then we will have a future, and a safe and stable future for the Syria we love. If you want to comment on anything that we've been talking about here on ANN Television, I'd be grateful to hear your views. We'd be grateful to hear your views. There's an email address on the screen now. Do email us. Do let us know what you think. And not just on the Syria issue, but that is, of course, key to our listeners, but also on the migration issue, where we're facing migration into Europe on a new scale. Is Europe behaving properly with regards to these desperate people who are coming over? Are they economic migrants, or are they genuinely all refugees? I think many of them are. Ways forward on this. Are we behaving properly in Europe? Are we behaving with sufficient compassion? Because compassion is what we should have. Bless you. Thank you for being with us. Do comment, do email us. Let us know what you think. Many thanks.